July 22, 1965, 11:58 p.m. Bumpy Johnson stood in the middle of Lenox Avenue with a gun pointed at his head. The man holding that gun was Vincent Gigant, also known as the Chin, one of the most dangerous enforcers in the Genovese crime family. Behind Gigant were 12 soldiers, all armed, all ready to pull their triggers. This should have been the end. Bumpy was 60 years old. He'd just been released from Alcatraz 3 months earlier. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and standing in the middle of the street with nowhere to run. But here's what makes this moment legendary. Bumpy wasn't scared. He was smiling. Because what Vincent Gigant didn't know, what the entire Genovese family didn't know, was that Bumpy had been expecting this exact moment for 6 weeks. He knew who'd betrayed him. He knew why they'd betrayed him. And he'd spent those 6 weeks setting up the most devastating counter-move in mob history. What nobody understood until years later, when the FBI files were finally unsealed, was that the betrayal didn't come from the Italians. It came from inside Bumpy's own organization. From someone he'd trusted for 15 years. Someone he'd protected. Someone he'd treated like family. And when Bumpy exposed that betrayal in front of the entire Harlem underworld, it didn't just save his life. It destroyed the mob's attempt to take over Harlem and sent a message that would echo for the next decade. If you want to understand how Bumpy Johnson stayed alive and in power for 40 years, you need to understand what happened on July 22, 1965. Hit that subscribe button because this story is about to show you the darkest side of loyalty and the most brilliant example of strategic revenge. To understand what happened in July 1965, you need to understand where Bumpy Johnson was in his life and why the mob thought they finally had him. Bumpy had just spent 11 years in prison. From 1954 to 1965, he was locked up in some of the toughest facilities in America, including 5 years in Alcatraz. He was arrested for drug conspiracy, a charge he always claimed was fabricated by the NYPD and the federal government working together to remove him from Harlem. When Bumpy got released in April 1965, he came home to a very different Harlem. The neighborhood had changed. Urban renewal was destroying historic buildings. Drugs, specifically heroin, were flooding the streets. The Italian mob had expanded their operations during his absence. And most importantly, the power structure Bumpy had built in the 1940s and 1950s was fractured. Some of his old associates had died. Some had retired. Some had made their own deals with the Italians. The numbers racket, which Bumpy had fought to keep in black hands for decades, was now partially controlled by the Genovese family. Bumpy was a legend, but legends don't mean much if you don't have an organization to back them up. The Genovese family, led by Vito Genovese from prison and executed on the streets by his underboss Thomas Eboli, saw an opportunity. Bumpy was old. He was isolated. He'd been away for 11 years. They thought he'd lost his edge. They thought they could finally eliminate him and complete their takeover of Harlem. But they needed someone on the inside to help them do it. Someone who knew Bumpy's routines. Someone who knew his associates. Someone who knew where he'd be vulnerable. They found that person in Reggie Walker. Reggie had been part of Bumpy's organization since 1950. He'd started as a numbers runner when he was 19. Bumpy had mentored him, protected him, helped him rise through the ranks. By the time Bumpy went to prison in 1954, Reggie was running one of the largest policy banks in Harlem. While Bumpy was locked up, Reggie kept the operation going. He sent money to Bumpy's wife. He maintained relationships with key people. He was loyal, or so everyone thought. The truth was, Reggie had been dealing with the Italians since 1958. He'd made a separate arrangement with Thomas Eboli. Reggie would keep running his numbers bank, but he'd pay the Genovese family 40% of his profits. In exchange, the mob would leave him alone and give him protection. For 7 years, Reggie lived a double life. To Harlem, he was Bumpy's man, holding down the organization while the boss was away. To the Italians, he was a collaborator, paying tribute and feeding them information. When Bumpy got released in April 1965, Reggie knew his double game was about to be exposed. If Bumpy started asking questions about money, about operations, about who was paying who, the whole scheme would unravel. So Reggie made a decision. He decided to help the Italians kill Bumpy Johnson before Bumpy could figure out the truth. The plan was simple. Reggie would get Bumpy out in the open. Somewhere public but not too crowded. He'd set up a meeting under the pretense of discussing business, and the Italians would be waiting. Thomas Eboli assigned Vincent Gigant to handle the hit. Gigant was perfect for the job. He was ruthless, smart, and absolutely loyal to the Genovese family. He'd proven himself by shooting Frank Costello in 1957, an attack that helped Vito Genovese consolidate power. Gigant was told to bring enough men to make sure the job got done. Bumpy Johnson couldn't be allowed to escape. The hit was scheduled for July 22, 1965 at midnight. Reggie would bring Bumpy to Lenox Avenue near 135th Street under the pretense of meeting with some old associates who wanted to welcome Bumpy home. It was believable. Bumpy had been gone for 11 years. People wanted to see him. Reggie set the meeting for late at night because fewer witnesses meant less risk. Everything was in place. But what Reggie didn't know was that Bumpy had been watching him since the day he got out of prison. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive 40 years in the underworld by trusting people. He survived by verifying everything. When Bumpy got released, the first thing he did was talk to people, not his old associates, not the people who'd stayed visible during his time away. He talked to the invisible people, the bartenders, the cab drivers, the shop owners, the janitors, people nobody paid attention to. People who saw everything, and what they told him was disturbing. They told him Reggie Walker had been meeting with Italian mobsters. They told him money was flowing from Reggie's operation to the Genovese family. They told him Reggie had gotten rich during Bumpy's absence, richer than a numbers banker should be. Bumpy didn't confront Reggie. That would have tipped his hand. Instead, he watched. He had people follow Reggie, document his movements, record his meetings, and within 3 weeks, Bumpy had. Reggie Walker had betrayed him. Reggie was working for the Italians, and based on the pattern of meetings and the sudden increase in security around Reggie, Bumpy knew something was coming. A lesser man would have killed Reggie immediately, would have confronted him, put a bullet in him, and moved on. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't a lesser man. Bumpy saw an opportunity. If Reggie was setting up a hit, Bumpy could use that setup to send a message, not just to Reggie, to the entire mob. To everyone in Harlem who thought Bumpy Johnson was finished, Bumpy decided to let the trap play out, but he'd be ready. July 22, 1965, 11:30 p.m. Reggie called Bumpy and told him about the meeting on Lenox Avenue. Bumpy agreed to come. He sounded eager, grateful that old friends wanted to see him. Reggie hung up the phone thinking everything was going according to plan. What Reggie didn't know was that Bumpy had already assembled 30 men. They were positioned on rooftops, in doorways, in cars parked along the street, all of them armed, all of them waiting for Bumpy's signal. Bumpy walked onto Lenox Avenue at 11:58 p.m. alone, no visible protection, just an old man in a suit walking to meet some friends. Vincent Gigant and his 12 soldiers were waiting. They stepped out of the shadows, guns drawn. Gigant walked straight up to Bumpy and put a pistol to his head. Nothing personal, Bumpy, just business. Bumpy didn't flinch. He looked Gigant in the eye and smiled. You sure about that? Gigant hesitated. Something was wrong. Bumpy was too calm, too confident. You might want to look around, Bumpy said quietly. Gigant glanced up. On every rooftop surrounding them, he saw armed men. In every doorway, more men with rifles. In every parked car, shotguns visible through the windows. Gigant and his 12 soldiers were surrounded by 30 guns, all pointed at them. Bumpy had turned the ambush into a counter-ambush. Here's how this is going to work, Bumpy said, his voice carrying across the silent street. You're going to put your guns down, you're going to walk away, and you're going to tell Thomas Eberly that Harlem isn't for sale, not now, not ever. Gigant's hand was still steady, gun still pressed against Bumpy's head. But he knew he was beaten. If he pulled that trigger, his entire crew would be dead within seconds. And Vincent, Bumpy continued, I know who set this up. I know who's been feeding you information, and I'm going to deal with that myself. Gigant slowly lowered his gun. His soldiers followed his lead. They backed away, weapons at their sides, eyes scanning the rooftops, knowing they'd just escaped a massacre. Bumpy turned and looked directly at Reggie Walker, who was standing across the street watching the whole thing unfold. Reggie's face went white. He knew. Bumpy knew everything. Reggie, Bumpy called out, his voice cutting through the night air. Come here. Reggie didn't move. He couldn't. Fear had paralyzed him. Bumpy walked toward him, slowly, deliberately, every step measured. When Bumpy reached Reggie, he didn't pull a gun. He didn't throw a punch. He just looked at him. Looked at the man he'd mentored for 15 years, the man he'd trusted, the man who'd tried to have him killed. You've been working with them since 1958, Bumpy said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Reggie tried to deny it, started to say something about misunderstandings, about pressure, about having no choice. Bumpy held up a hand. Don't. I have witnesses. I have documentation. I know everything. Bumpy pulled an envelope from his jacket. Inside were photographs. Reggie meeting with Thomas Eberly. Reggie accepting payments. Reggie discussing Bumpy's movements with Italian mobsters. I could kill you right now, Bumpy said. Nobody would stop me. Nobody would care. You betrayed your own people for Italian money. Reggie fell to his knees, started begging, promising it would never happen again, promising loyalty. Bumpy looked down at him with something worse than anger, disappointment. Get out of Harlem, Bumpy said. Tonight, take whatever money you have and disappear. If I ever see you again, if I ever hear your name again, if you ever contact anyone in this neighborhood again, you're dead. Do you understand? Reggie nodded, tears streaming down his face. And Reggie, Bumpy added, Everyone's going to know what you did. Everyone's going to know you betrayed Bumpy Johnson for mob money. You're going to live the rest of your life knowing that every person who knows your name knows you're a traitor." Reggie scrambled to his feet and ran. Literally ran down Lenox Avenue, disappearing into the darkness. Bumpy turned back to face the crowd that had gathered. Dozens of people from the neighborhood, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. "Let this be a lesson," Bumpy announced, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Loyalty can't be bought, Harlem can't be sold, and anyone who thinks I'm too old or too weak to protect what we've built, they just saw what happens when they test me." Word of what happened on Lenox Avenue spread through New York's underworld within hours. By morning, every mobster from Brooklyn to the Bronx knew the story. Bumpy Johnson had walked into an ambush unarmed and walked out in complete control. The Genovese family called an emergency meeting. Thomas Eberly was furious not at Bumpy, at Vincent Gigant for failing, but the wiser heads in the family saw the bigger picture. "We can't beat him," one capo said. "We've tried everything. We had a man inside his organization for 7 years and Bumpy still knew. He's always going to know. He's always going to be 3 steps ahead." The Genovese family made a decision that day. They would continue operating in Harlem, but they would never again try to eliminate Bumpy Johnson. The cost was too high. The risk was too great. Bumpy had proven even at 60 years old, even after 11 years in prison, that he was still the most dangerous man in Harlem. Reggie Walker disappeared completely. Some say he went to Chicago, others say Detroit. Nobody knows for sure. What everyone does know is that he never returned to New York. He lived the rest of his life in exile, carrying the shame of betraying the one man who'd given him everything. The 30 men who'd backed Bumpy up that night became the core of his rebuilt organization. They'd proven their loyalty. They'd risked their lives without hesitation. And Bumpy took care of them for the remaining 3 years of his life. The lesson from July 22, 1965 became part of Harlem's code. Betrayal has consequences that go beyond death. Reggie could have been killed. Instead, he was exiled, branded as a traitor, forced to live knowing he'd destroyed his own reputation for money that meant nothing once he lost his home. What Bumpy Johnson did in July 1965 was more than just surviving an assassination attempt. He transformed a moment of vulnerability into a demonstration of power. Think about the position he was in. 60 years old, just out of prison, facing down one of the most violent mob families in New York. Most people in that situation would have gone into hiding, would have negotiated, would have compromised. Bumpy did the opposite. He exposed the betrayal publicly. He surrounded his enemies with overwhelming force. He showed mercy to the traitor in a way that was more devastating than violence. And he sent a message that echoed for years. You cannot buy Harlem. You cannot intimidate Harlem. You cannot defeat Bumpy Johnson. The brilliance wasn't the counter-ambush, though that was impressive. The brilliance was knowing about the betrayal 6 weeks in advance and using that knowledge to orchestrate a perfect demonstration of power. Bumpy could have prevented the ambush entirely. He could have killed Reggie quietly and moved on. Instead, he let it play out in public where everyone could see, where the Italians could witness their failure, where the community could see that Bumpy was still in control. That's not just strategy, that's theater. And in the underworld, perception is reality. Bumpy Johnson lived 3 more years after that night. He died in 1968, not from mob bullets, not from betrayal, but from a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant, surrounded by people who loved and respected him. The man who'd been betrayed by someone he'd trusted for 15 years. The man who'd survived 40 years in the most dangerous business in America. The man who proved that real power doesn't come from violence. It comes from intelligence, preparation, and the courage to face your enemies knowing you've already won. If this story revealed something about loyalty and power that you'd never considered before, smash that like button right now. This is exactly the kind of deep dive content we create every single week. Real history, real strategy, real lessons about how power actually works. Subscribe to this channel because we're building the definitive collection of Bumpy Johnson stories, and every single one teaches you something that schools won't and history books can't. Drop a comment and tell me, was Bumpy right to exile Reggie instead of killing him? Or was mercy a mistake in this situation? I want to know what you think. And turn on those notifications because next time we're breaking down the moment Bumpy Johnson walked into Malcolm X's rally and prevented an assassination that would have changed American history. You absolutely cannot afford to miss that story. Remember, in the world Bumpy Johnson navigated, loyalty wasn't just important, it was everything. And the worst punishment wasn't death. It was being known as the person who broke the code. Reggie Walker learned that lesson, and Harlem never forgot.